Hi, my name is W.haffey, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the history of parkour in Quebec with a focus on Montreal. I've been following parkour in Montreal since 2023. A lot of renowned parkour projects came out that year in Montreal, and I also decided to move here that same year, so I did also some more investigations into the parkour scene in Montreal. I've been doing parkour since I was 10 years old and have been a part of the Montreal parkour community for about 4 months now. Parkour here has significantly evolved since its conception 30 years ago, and a lot of parkour culture and cultural exports come from Montreal, and it's a big player in the parkour scene, so that's why I think it's important to talk about. Also, I don't think this is something that has been really discussed in depth before, so I think that's why I can provide valuable insight. I will also talk about the challenges facing parkour in Montreal today and how parkour's growth in Quebec can be tied to other social, urban, and youth movements in Quebec. The first thing that I want to talk about is the first people to do anything that was like resembling parkour in Quebec, and that was detailed in a book. It was fiction, but it was describing things that were happening at the time, called Sur les toits des maisons, on the roofs of houses. It's about two teenage boys who are running across the rooftops of Quebec. The boys would cross the city, going from roof to roof, hopping between the roofs, and transforming the town's geography into how they want it to be. Parkour was a traversal in its inception, getting from point A to point B as fast as possible. That's kind of the same practice described in this book, even though nobody really knew what parkour was. Parkour's inception, or the first time people called it parkour, was by David Bell in Nice, banlieue in France in the 90s. It was a high-density, lower-class community, and it made a perfect occasion for rooftop hopping. If I were to guess why these both evolved at the same time, I would say that parkour in Nice and rooftoping in Quebec City both have some kind of mutual evolution in architecture and ideology, with architects having the same problem of wanting to fit a lot of people in a small area, and so they ended up coming to a similar solution of banlieue. To make a parallel, David Bell and the Quebecois youth probably had the same idea of wanting to traverse the city without any interruptions, so they came up with a similar solution of parkour. Parkour allowed them to change the geography of the city into what they wanted it to be by free movement and letting them take a new analysis of the built environment towards change. David Bell, who was the guy who started parkour in Nice, started his movement off of a theory called La Méthode Naturelle, which was posed by a military general called Georges Hébert after his time as a colonial officer in Martinique in the 1900s. He saw the physical fitness of the native people there and their athleticism and wanted to model it in a theory that David Bell then used to create parkour. This is not unlike many other groups at the time, like hip-hop, jazz, even some civil rights movements in Quebec that took themselves after minority and Caribbean cultures. It's hard to say that Sur les toits des maisons had the same impact. From what I can tell, this book described the practices of the time, but was not taken after, nor did the two movements share any kind of continuity. Parkour's big break was when David Bell and his friends decided to make movies that got put on TV, like Yamasaki and Jump London, which inspired many youths to pick up similar practices. Even in Quebec, that was really its start in Quebec, was people watching on TV Jump London, Yamasaki, and copying it from there. So there's not the same continuity between Sur les toits des maisons and the modern parkour movement in Montreal. Topics like flips or no flips, advice on parkour moves, gatherings and events, and anything else you could think of would be discussed on forums, with many being set up at the time like Urban Free Flow and PK514. PK514, which was started in 2004, was called PK514 because of parkour, and then 514 being the Montreal area code. On it, there was lots of discussions about parkour in Montreal, just discussions about parkour, and events gatherings and meetings. Yeah, so we're talking about PK514 in Montreal, even though rooftop running may have started in Quebec City. We'll still be talking mainly about Montreal because that's where most of the cultural exports come from, and Montreal has more spots, more parkour history, and more people than any other parkour community in Quebec. Still, most of what we're talking about is in Montreal and PK514, where many things would be discussed in English and in French between members. It's also a main page for top-down announcements like parkour meetups and gym sessions, where they would host weekly parkour lessons in a gym called Gymnics, where they would teach people about parkour moves and flips in a gymnastics gym, which I think is awesome that it was starting there, and that's a good start for it, but a gymnastics gym is never what a parkour gym will be, because a parkour gym will have structures, wooden structures, bars that aren't really replicable in a gymnastics gym. And also, there were these top-down announcements that were used on these forums to promote jams, clothing, and other parkour-related merch, which many in the community would have started. Jams would happen all around Quebec and Toronto, and people would come from far away to attend them, especially the annual Montreal Jam, which would draw in a large crowd. Jams were a way to meet other people in the parkour community, practice at new spots, and find new environments to film parkour at. Montreal became a parkour cultural hotspot with places like McGill, the Biodome, and Vigor Square being common meeting spots for the parkour community. People in Montreal would use the structures and the concrete jungles that these places were as playgrounds to practice, show off, and learn new parkour moves. These spots were remarkable for their varied heights, brutalist architecture, and interesting designs that let people actualize what they wanted to do for videos and for practice. Eventually, PK514 shut down, and some of its streams went towards Facebook groups, and other portions went towards creating a merged online space that was called pkquebec.ca, which was a merger between PKQC and PK514, which were not competing sites, but for sites for different areas in Quebec. This merger allowed people in both communities to connect and share their ideas in 2007, which was also the same year that people started posting their parkour videos on YouTube, which changed the style of dissimulation of parkour ideas. Instead, where before, if you wanted to share your video, you would have to already be sharing it to people who did parkour, or be so famous that you were getting in a movie or on TV. This changed the previous top-down structure to a much more egalitarian bottom-up structure, with anyone being able to post their own videos that anyone else could see via YouTube. With this, the parkour level that people saw may have dropped significantly. Like, there were just videos back then of people goofing around, and there was not the same burden, like having to get on the news to show how good you were at parkour. And I think this was good for parkour, but along with, more people getting into it, even though there were more people posting their beginner level clips, there were also more people advancing and getting better, and having bigger jams and meetups. Maybe the most significant change, I would say, that really drew a lot of people into parkour was not just doing flips and cheesy handstands, but people emphasizing the joy of doing parkour and hanging out with friends, which many saw like, oh, I want to have that same community, I want to have that same boyish fun that I see online, and brought a lot of people into the sport. You can also see that a lot of these videos had breakdancers in them, which could be confusing to you at first, as you may think that these are entirely different sports, but these two movements have more ties than you'd think. The foundational idea of expression through movement within the context of a hip-hop beat and the embodiment of free movement and counter-authoritarianism is quite similar to parkour, obviously with the distinction of parkour having no beat but having obstacles instead which constrain you. Instead of the same anti-authoritarianism, I would say parkour has a more revolt against the modern city, which I think is a little bit different. Many thought processes can be identical with both seemingly expressing creativity and the self. Both also involve physical and aesthetic development through training and improvement. And even today, you can see a lot of hip hop moves being integrated into parkour, and a lot of hip hoppers integrating parkour moves like the backflip and the macaco. It also helped that gyms had spring floors, which sometimes hip hoppers would use to change, or b-boys would use to train at, and then also that parkour people like to train at. So you got that natural overlap and symbiosis of training together, but still, like, having a segregated space for parkour I still think is pretty important, which is why the first parkour gym in Montreal was opened in 2014, allowing many people to get into the sport for the first time, because starting parkour on concrete without mats or spring floor or coaches can be pretty grueling. So having a spot like the spot in Montreal was, I think, very beneficial to the parkour community in Montreal, and allowed parkour to be springboarded into new heights in Montreal. And obviously, and one of the reasons I think it did so well was because it was so much better than anything else at the time, that gymnastics or any other indoor trampoline park just did not have the same equipment or technologies that was at the spot in Montreal. Unfortunately, though, it did shut down in 2020 due to COVID, but since 2015, there have been a lot of parkour gyms that have spread around Quebec and Montreal, with Quebec City getting its first outdoor parkour park and its own parkour gym in 2023. But there have also been gyms that have been all emerging through small towns in Quebec as well. In 2023, there was also a gym opened in Montreal called ACTN3, which hosted the qualifiers for the World Parkour Championships in the same year. It is fantastic to me because it showed a lot of people what Montreal parkour had to offer and put a lot of eyes on the gym. It also brought a lot of famous athletes to Montreal to train, so I think it was a great opportunity and a great thing to show off parkour in Montreal. The Concordia Parkour Club were a group of like-minded young adults who would train at spots around Montreal and learn moves, and they were getting quite promoted. They were on the news, they got news articles, and they were also in the group promoting events and opportunities for stunting and jobs. And I think these news articles are not something that were new. I think there's always something that have been helping the parkour community, but parkour has been on Radio Canada interviews going back as early as 2005. Still, even then, it's always kind of been written from a non-parkour point of view, and it's never been from the parkour perspective, which is why I think it's really cool that in 2023 there's a parkour magazine slash photo book showing parkour from the lens, both figuratively and literally, of the parkour perspective, and it showed all the awesome things happening in Montreal through photography. The same group that made it also did a parkour video in the same year, 2023, called Mind the Gap, which was a critically acclaimed 20-minute feature showing talent, comedy, and creativity in classic Montreal spots by Quebecois tracers, with 50,000 views on YouTube. This showed the world what parkour was in Montreal, what it was like, and the absolute talent that tracers in Montreal show, and it gave a lot of recognition to the athletes. In another cultural export, there was an international production called Gate Crashers, which featured a long-time Quebecois athlete called Tamila, who performed in the video and showed off her talents, and the video is now sitting at 3,000 views on YouTube. And so that's pretty huge, and it's featuring a Quebecois athlete, so I think that's pretty awesome, how people think about Quebec now as like somewhere with international athletes. And this year's Parkour World Championships in Vancouver, we saw 2 women from Quebec competing in the style division and placing quite well. That's why I think parkour, talking about it and the history, is so important, is because of how big and mainstream it's getting and how much people are seeing Montreal as somewhere pushing forward in the parkour scene. Even just like the World Championships, even in older parkour videos, women have always been large players in the parkour scene. In an environment which can be pretty hostile to women and often frames them as girlfriends or sex objects or not really responsive to women wanting to join. I've heard stories of women who I've talked to personally telling me that they've been kicked out of training sessions just for being girls, or the men think, oh, you're too weak to perform parkour. Unlike the general narrative, there have always been girls in Montreal parkour events, and there are still women to this day who are leading parkour not only in Montreal but worldwide. So I wanted to mention them, and I thought I'd also compare it to the women's graffiti movement in Quebec, where they're using graffiti to transform spaces into what they want and to sell the message they want to sell by spraying on the walls. And I think parkour allows a similar self-expression for women, allowing them to turn spaces also into what they want, but instead of through spray paint, through movement and creativity. Finally, I'd like to talk about a challenge facing parkour, that there have been these excellent parkour spots throughout Montreal that have been making people come and making people stay for parkour, and these spots allow people to do some truly incredible feats and encourage people to go to Montreal and try these moves out themselves. But there have been recently some resistance to places that people do parkour in. The educational building, which used to have a lot of cool parkour challenges, got redid, and they removed a lot of the parkour challenges and put up prickly bushes, which stopped people from doing parkour. Or the Biodome, which has been a awesome parkour spot and a centerpiece of many jams. It's undergoing significant renovations, and they're taking out parts of it. They're redoing parts of it through construction, which, sucks. These places were really awesome for parkour. Additionally, the spot called Vigor Square was torn down and is still under construction. And if you look at their plans for what they're doing, they have no interest in making it parkour viable again. It was also a nice park within the Chinatown of Montreal, and they're getting rid of it. Urban renewal is affecting not one but two communities and how they intersect. So as you can see, parkour has had a massive development in Quebec, changing from something small and started by a few guys just messing around doing gymnastics, messing around and going to gymnastics gyms. So something that has created a significant cultural exports from Montreal that made people see what parkour had to offer. And not only from men, but from women, using the practices and forms of self-expression and resistance. Obviously, though, Montreal is a city that needs maintenance and has urban decay. And with urban decay comes urban renewal. But I still would love to see a little more respect towards the Montreal parkour community and the Montreal parkour spots that have traditionally allowed so much self-expression by the city. Also, knowing about the history of parkour in Montreal may give a stronger incentive to protect these classic spots, which parkour's growth and maintenance in Montreal rely upon. Thank you for listening, and thank you for lending your ears to my project of Quebec and parkour revitalization and growth in Quebec.